but I used to be in a group that's somewhat alike to the Scouts. We spend a lot of time in the woods, and weird stuff happens often, but a lot of the time, they're easy to explain. One thing happened though, that to this day scares the life out of me. I was a leader for the age of 8 to 10 years old, and we're out on a camping trip. It was the first year we stayed on that terrain. It was huge. Normally, we tend to explore the majority of a terrain before the kids arrive, so we're aware of any possible danger and the spots to avoid. This time, that's impossible though. Every camp we always have a night called game night. It's usually a scary game in which the kids have to complete several tasks while the leaders scare the life out of them. Obviously, we had one too during that camp. We put monster masks on and hid out in the woods close to the checkpoints they pass. While running in between checkpoints, I found an open stretch of forest with little to no foliage, so it's ideal to chase after them. There was no real room to hide besides behind trees, so I couldn't use my flashlight or they'd be able to see me from miles away. It's dark. I like the unsettling kind of dark that plays tricks on your eyes, where you're imagining things that aren't real. During the stay there, I see a shadow that's around my size passing me a few times. I can't see it very well, so I am assuming that it's just my mind playing tricks on me. When I turn my flashlight on, I can't see anything. Now the game's nearing its end. I saw the shadow again. This time, I could see it vaguely standing near a tree not far away from me. I thought it was one of the others, hiding there ready to scare the kids, and decided to go over there, as it's about time to go back. I aim my flashlight towards a tree while getting closer. I now notice that there's indeed somebody standing there, dressed in what appears to be a torn down burlap sack, and having their head covered with a white plastic bag. Everything appears to be tied together though. I start to feel pure dread, and nothing else. Something is really off here. I ask if everything's okay. There's no response. Now the only thing that I heard was this sound that appears as though somebody's knocking on wood. Nevertheless, I went a bit closer until I'm about 10 meters away from this person. The knocking sound turns out to be a person smashing their head repeatedly into the tree. They're barefoot. Arms and legs are covered with mud. Hands are weirdly cramped. I was convinced this is one of the leaders messing around with me, so I say, "Hey, knock it off." He then slowly turns his head to me, begins smiling and walking towards me. Something inside me just told me to run. It didn't matter if it's just a stupid prank. I ran away. Now, if this wasn't a prank, I was in serious danger, so I run as fast as I can. I heard him running behind me. I didn't wait to turn though. I might have hit a tree. I arrived back at the campsite, and every single person that could be dressed like that was already there. They couldn't have gotten there before me. Still, I said to them, "Yeah guys, you got me there." And they just look at me weird, thinking I'm trying to scare them, and we left it at that. For the following day, I wanted to check it out. Who knows, maybe somebody ate the wrong mushroom, and might be out there dying of hypothermia. I took someone else with me just in case, and there was nothing but endless trees. We arrive at the tree where I saw them, and there was a dead, skinned, decomposing rabbit nailed to the tree. We called the police. However, when the police have finished their investigation, they tell us that no, it's just a prank by one of the other scouts, and that we have nothing to worry about. Weirded out, we brush it off and get on with the rest of the camping trip. To this day, I have no explanation for it whatsoever, and that person is probably still out there. In 2016, my boyfriend and I went camping in eastern Pennsylvania. The place we decided to stop for the night was primitive. The camping was free, no cell service, barely a road, etc. We did encounter 2 other people. They might not factor into what happened, but I'll describe them. The first woman was next to her truck at the side of the road. She had the hood open and seemed to be waiting for someone to stop by and offer help. Usually my boyfriend has no problem helping someone, but he said this time something about her put him off. She didn't really seem to do anything wrong at the first glance, but usually when you want help, you look hopeful as you approach someone. She looked exactly as though she expected us to stop. That's what my boyfriend said anyway. I hadn't really noticed anything that strange about her though. The next person we had come across had chosen a spot and we're setting up a fire for hot dogs. I had noticed people drive by a few times, but my boyfriend pointed out each time there was the same car, and the man in the car watched us every pass. My boyfriend was a little uneasy about this, but we'd driven around for a while before finding a place that we both agreed on. It had been raining and everything was muddy. We wanted the driest place that we could possibly find. He could have been doing the same thing. We briefly thought about moving to the next side of the road, but it was muddy too. If he wanted to find us, all he had to do was search for the tracks. There were some other tracks, but not many. He'd only have to backtrack a little to locate us again. He didn't come by another time, so we stayed, and spent several remaining hours goofing off before dark. No one else drove by. Now whether or not these two had anything to do with our experience, the real fear it came later. We had gone to sleep in our tent sometime around 3 AM and were awoken by this very loud noise. I can't describe it very well or remember exactly what it sounded like, but my boyfriend said it reminded him of a chain gun revving up. It was also similar to how it would sound if someone recorded a shovel being dragged over gravel and played it over a loudspeaker. He jumped up, looked out the little window, but couldn't really see anything. The sound repeated itself multiple times. I was too scared to speak, so my boyfriend whispered that it's probably miles off and I should sleep. I didn't question this, as I figured loud sounds could easily be heard miles off. After we left, he told me it sounded like it had actually been coming from just down the road, but he didn't want to freak me out. Looking back, I probably should have wondered why he would bother to whisper if it's so far off. I was terrified still. Every little thing I heard outside sounded like somebody walking around the tent. We laid there for a while longer when my boyfriend told me to get dressed because we're leaving. I got alarmed by this, and even more alarmed when he unwrapped the machete we brought for the trip out of his plastic. We now quickly load up the car. I look around for footprints that aren't our own, but despite the moon providing plenty of light, I can't really see. I did point out something to my boyfriend that he hasn't noticed so before we get to the car. There was a beer can by our dead fire that hasn't been there before. We didn't even bring any beer. While we were driving away, my boyfriend explained that he was nervous somebody had been luring us out. He knew it wasn't a good idea to run from the tent immediately. He also half expected us to find out the gas tank had been siphoned. But that wouldn't have stopped us because we had a hybrid car. Now, we never actually had an explanation to what the sounds were that night or the weird people, but I'm almost definite that seeing them people and the following events were linked, and have a horrible feeling that something terrible would have happened had we stayed there for any longer. One of my best buds from college was a geologist major that ended up becoming a ranger in the southeast US. He hadn't spoken to me in years, but I remember about 10 years back when he was telling me about an old married couple that he had recently helped out. He had seen them come to the park several days in a row and found out they're visiting from out west. They'd gotten engaged decades prior. They'd been searching for the spot they'd taken pictures of where he asked a question. After looking at the pics and figuring out roughly where they were, he escorted them in his vehicle. They then hiked to where they thought it might be. They found it, and he left them and goes back to the station at the entrance. He said he got a weird feeling once he got back, and felt like he needed to wait to see them whenever they left. Well, once it come time to lock up at night, he still hasn't seen them leave, so he reports it. Left his assistant to wait at the shack at the entrance, and went back to where he left them. He found both of them lying down along the bank of the river. Both are dead. He calls the police, went through the 9 yards and went home. The police were able to disclose him their identities, but weren't sure anything else initially. He later learns that the wife was terminally ill with cancer. They both killed themselves along there. They chose to do it at that exact spot. My bud was torn up about it. He just hated the fact that they had to ask him where they needed to go, and he was the one to lead them there. This happened 17 years ago. It's the summer of '99. I was spending the vacation with my mother in New Mexico. I was a 12-year-old girl, going 21, and had a severe attitude. I made friends easily with a few girls that lived around the corner from my mum's home. We spent every moment together that summer. We were a group of 4. All of us thinking we're older and smarter than everyone else. There was Nikki, Katie, Julie and myself. We're the last generation of home phone lines, playing outside on the trampoline until dark and sleepovers. We watched VHS tapes. We would listen to cassette tapes on our Walkman. It was okay to let your children walk around town at night, and we rarely locked the front door. We had no cell phones or internet. My backyard had a concrete wall around it and a gate. Behind the wall was desert as far as the eye could see. Just a barren wasteland of dirt, cacti, shrubs and mountains way off in the distance. This town had a major railroad track running straight through it, and there was a major street that had a gas station, restaurants, hotels and attractions. We all received the same warnings from our parents. Stay away from the desert, stay away from the tracks, don't walk the main strip at night. Do you think we listened? Absolutely not. Julie, Nikki and I spent our days walking through the desert, crossing the tracks down the strip to Katie's home. Sometimes we would walk around until dusk. No. Some days we would just go to my home and jump on the trampoline. This particular day, we got to Katie's home, prepared to stay the weekend because her parents are out of town and we're having a party. The first night the girls were jumping from a spiral staircase to a giant beanbag. I refused to participate in this due to my extreme fear of heights. When we got down to the sleepover business, we watched The Exorcist. You know, the old Linda Blair one. Really creepy. I didn't sleep. The second night we all told our parents that Katie's mum was going to drive us to the movies. We all got money for the movies and promptly walked down the strip to go and get junk food at the store. Now, I wish I could say that we're aware of the surroundings, but we're not. We're absolutely oblivious of the man behind us, who followed us all the way back to the home. I feel that I should mention that Katie's parents were loaded, had a huge property with numerous buildings and broken down cars that her dad was remodeling. Their home had a large open kitchen, dining and living room. There were no walls and the whole room was lined with windows. There were 2 doors, front and back. The day went just as planned. We get our junk food and made it home safely. We made pizza in the oven, and for some reason, one of the girls turned on the TV to the news channel. As we were eating, we heard a story about staying indoors, because there's a report of a suspicious man walking the strip. That's it, suspicious man. We laugh and joke about it. Fast forward a few hours. I don't remember what happened, but as girls do, someone said something that hurt Julie's feelings and she stormed out of the home. I went after her and opened the front door just in time to see her lighting up a cigarette. I sat with her on the bench while she spoke about the other 2. Suddenly, the air gets thick with anxiety. Julie felt it too. I quietly asked if she felt as though we were being watched. She responded with a tiny nod, and then we're blinded. Someone was in a car in the driveway with bright lights on us. My heart was racing as I stood up and pulled Julie out of the spot she seemed to be stuck in. As we turned and ran inside, the man made a sound. I can't describe this sound other than a high-pitched squeal, turning to a growl. I was scared beyond all reason, but I somehow managed to get myself, Julie, back inside. As soon as we get inside, the headlights went off and it's pitch black again. I locked the door, turned the light off. By this time, Julie had regained most of her composure to tell the other 2 what had happened, as I frantically checked the back door and turn off all the lights. I told them to shut up and listen by the back door. I heard the car door close as I was praying to every god that he would go away. Then, right next to my head, The door handle begins to turn slowly, then frantically. I crawled away from the door and moved to where my friends are. For the next 2 or 3 hours, we sat as still as stone, listening to this man banging on every single window trying to get inside. The phone was located across the room, right next to 2 windows. Finally, I get up. I have the courage and run to the phone and call my mum. I told her that we're all alone, and someone's trying to get in. I hung up with her and waited. The banging sound now suddenly stops. We sat and waited, listening to him get in his car, and then the sound of that squeal, it turns into a growl. Really piercing. Then he's gone. The mum and stepdad showed up and checked out the whole place. They found tire tracks, but that was it. We know he was there for a while. The truly scary part was the scratch marks all over the doors and windows. It almost looks as though a human could not have made it. Needless to say, Katie spent the rest of the weekend at Nikki's house and had a great story for her parents when they got home. Our parents didn't punish us for lying. I guess it's hours of torture at this weird person or whatever it was enough. We made a police report, but they never found anything. I just don't understand the almost inhuman sounds that he made and the scratch marks. That's the part that scares me to this day. Backpacking in the Yukon, we met this dude named Carl in Dawson at a free dinner put on by the town church. He said to my friend and I, who were both girls, "Where are we staying?" We said we're in the backcountry camping in a safe place. Then he went on to say that he knows the entire area like the back of his hand. He then wanted specifics. We lied, and we said that we're at a main campsite. We finish our dinner, tried to run out of there, but he corners us, offering to give us a ride back to the campsite. Luckily, we have a car, so said no thanks, and tried to make a run for it. We got back in our car and started driving down the road to where we were camping. Now it's the Yukon. There's only a few people driving back and forth, and we took a turn onto a gravel road heading north. We realised there's been a truck following us since we left town. We especially noticed once we were on this gravel road with absolutely no service and no emergency services. There are literally no turn-offs on this road. Even if there was, we're in prime bear territory next to a river, so running for it's not even worth it. My friend decides to try and pull a fast one on Carl, so we blitz down the gravel road until we hit snow. The whole road is covered in snow and ice, and we can't go much further in the pace that she's set. We see a campsite ahead of us, blitz it there, and park the car on the far side of the road to hopefully confuse the guy. We grab our tents, sleeping bags, food, and everything warm within our vicinity and run for it. We saw the campsite had a shelter in the middle. We knew that we had to get warm quickly, so the game plan was to run to the shelter, get fully dressed, prepare to sleep in the snow embankment. However, once we get to the shelter, we bump into a family of 12 people. We ran into the shelter swearing, cursing, and freaking out because we felt that it was so creepy Carl was after us. So once we turned around and saw the faces staring at us in amazement, we calmed down and tried and explain the situation. From the moment we utter the words, there's a man that's been following us for at least 100 kilometers. Everybody steps up. All of the men get up with their knives, running outside. The woman took us in. They had seen a dense patch of trees in the northeast corner of the campsite, and knew that all of us could hide within the trees without fear of being found. As we run into safety, we can hear the men yelling at Carl. There were loud noises, a car alarm, then complete silence. We knew the alarm belonged to us. It's our car. My friend and I stared at each other with tears in our eyes. We're in the northern part of the Yukon. In the snow at -10, we've just been followed from what we thought was going to be a free dinner from the local church. After about 30 minutes, the other woman decides it's time to return to the shelter and find the men. We turned and found the men safe and sound. Apparently, Carl had told them that we were none of their business, and that we wronged him in some sort of manner as he broke our car window, and then turned around to leave. One of the guys had a car, so had followed him down a good 20 kilometers before turning back. The woman invited my friend and I to sleep on their campsite, and we gladly obliged. We woke up the next morning safe and sound in the middle of the Yukon without cell or emergency services. We had a giant appreciation for finding them. Thank God we did. I was once fishing with a friend. We're in a lake in the middle of nowhere, and not a soul around. We had parked a few miles away, and had to walk through the dense woods with our gear to get there. It's about a 30-minute walk with the gear. To paint a picture, once you get to the lake, the trees open up, so you can see the lake around you, but no further through the trees. You lose cell reception during the car ride about half an hour away. A very secluded feeling, I must say. We've been here all day. A good 6 hours of daylight, not a soul around. It starts to get dark around 7:30, so we make a fire pit. Around 10 PM, we put the fire out. It's pitch black outside. My friend has just recast his rods after I'm done with mine, so we could settle in for the night. We stay up until around 1 AM, just cracking jokes and eating food. Only the sounds of nature, birds, owls and whatnot, and the wind around us. After we turned the tent light off about 1 AM, we heard zipping noises coming from outside. Just two. My friend nudges me and grabs a small bat, looks outside, and there's nothing there. 10 minutes go by. We're very confused as to what the noise was. We then hear a splash. We both jump up and run outside, but there was nothing visible in the water. No lights or people around from what we could see. We both get into our tent. By this time, I'm terrified, clutching onto a bat. We have no option but to stay. The car is too far away and the woods are too dense to walk through during the night, especially if someone is out there. Whilst we're inside, a very deep male voice sighed next to the tent. "You're not supposed to be there." My friend said, "Who's that?" There's no reply. We get up and look. Nobody's there. No noises of someone walking away. No nothing. We turn to the torches, quickly gathering them, looking around, shining in every direction. We stood there for about 5 minutes just checking, hoping to find some source of it to get an explanation. There's nothing. We go back to bed and don't sleep. We spoke very, very quietly for the next 6 hours. Now 6 AM eventually came, and the sun's out. We get the hell out of there. We went outside. There's blood on the trees, and a single footprint in the fire pit we had made the night prior that did not belong to either of us. I spent more than my fair time alone in the woods, but one occasion definitely stands out as the creepiest thing I've experienced for a while, and when no one else was around. I have a friend that has 40 acres out of town that he has slowly converted into a farm for his family. Years ago, when he mostly only had a dozen or so chickens out there, I spent a few months living on the property in a tent while I began seasonal work. At the time, the property was decades neglected, overgrown pasture land with a few clumps of denser woods. I had set up my tent right in the middle of the property, in a small clearing between two densely wooded areas. My friend would come by once a day to feed the animals. Other than that, I have zero chance of seeing another human unless I leave the property. I mean, I can't lie, I really enjoy the solitude and being taken to observe nature in a way that I've never really done before. When the incident occurred, I'd been living out there for about 2 months, so I was well used to the sounds of nature outside my tent. I'd even gotten to the point where I was so used to the sounds of nature outside my tent at night, I'd gotten to the point where I wouldn't even bother to get out of the tent and look if a small animal was walking my way around the tent at night. I'd even gotten used to the sound of that roof, where it pumped sometimes from the wind. My friend had been short on nails while he was building the roof over the pump, so the southeast corner wasn't nailed down, and a strong wind would cause the corner of the corrugated metal roof to peel, and then crash down loudly when the wind stopped. It was about 200 feet away from my tent, so it had caused me to jump a bit when I first moved out there. But within a month, it had just been another sound outside my tent. It was somewhat comforting though, like somebody who lives in a big city that can't sleep without the sounds of traffic outside their window. I probably helped myself by the fact that I knew it was paired with the sound of wind blowing through the trees. So on one night, I'm tucked inside my sleeping bag, starting to drift off when I hear the shed corner come crashing down. Nothing to worry about. I probably didn't even open my eyes, but then I hear what sounds like a person mimicking the sound of the shed. Right outside my tent. My blood freezes in my veins, my eyes open wide in the darkness. I hold perfectly still. I know that my friend has already come and gone hours before. I am alone on a piece of land that is large enough that there is no reason for a person to accidentally end up next to my tent in the middle of the night. After a few moments, the wind makes the shed roof crash again. And again, I hear a person mimicking the crashing sound a few seconds after. I called out and say, "Is anyone there?" Zero reply. I then hear the sound of the crashing a third time, but this time there was no mimicking sound, so I'm out of my sleeping bag, out of my tent, flashlight in one hand, camping knife in the other. I then shine my flashlight right out of my tent to where the sound is coming from. I need to see who is making the fake crashing sound. I see nothing. Now it's on the edge of the woods, but the sound had been so close. I can see through the brush well enough to tell that there isn't a person behind the bush and low branches. I'm still looking at the ground, and none of the dead leaves look partially disturbed. I'm trying to figure out how far somebody could have moved at a slow enough pace to not make enough sound for me to hear their footsteps on the leaf litter. That's when it crashes again. And I hear some more fake crashing sounds right next to me, where I'm 100% positive there's a person standing. At this point, my heart is beating a mile a minute. I'm getting ready to believe in the supernatural. Eventually I had enough and went back to sleep. I still didn't know what was making them sounds. I'd like to begin by describing myself, because I believe it's relevant to the story. I have to assume that I'm not the average author here. I'm 25, male, a bit above the average height. I've been doing sports 5 to 6 times a week since I've graduated high school. Gym, running, CrossFit, squash, swimming, as well as any sport that my friends decided to start playing. My favourite hobbies are mountaineering, hiking, and bouldering. I've just recently purchased a new pair of high altitude mountaineering boots because it's near the end of summer season. They're on sale. The plan is to wear them in the Alps next summer on a few ascents. I live in a European capital, one that's surrounded by nature with many trails and opportunities for hiking. I decided to break in my boots last Saturday, more specifically because it would have been my granddad's birthday. He also loved to hike before he died. These boots are overkill for these woods, but I needed to try them. I selected a nice route that's around 25 kilometers and set off at about 9 in the morning. It's rained just the day before, so I expected a fair amount of mud and not as many people, because a lot are scared off by the weather. Since the sun is excruciatingly hot, it's a nice change of temperature, especially between trees and such. In the not so distant past, my dog would have definitely joined me on this hike, but she's turning 14 this year and doesn't enjoy long walks anymore. My girlfriend had to do something for work on short notice, so I knew from that moment I'd be alone. The first half of the hike was perfect. The altitude difference along the trail is minimal. I barely broke a sweat and I misjudged how many people would be out due to the storm before. I met about 7 people during the first 3 hours. Most of them were cross-country runners. It's worth mentioning that I wasn't walking quick. I stepped on many occasions upon different animal trails and would stop to look. Between 12 and 1, the path ran into a road where cars could go. This road is asphalt, but deep in the forest and can only be used to reach certain landmarks that are also in the forest. Cars are rare here. My trail required me to take this road for a few hundred meters. As I'm walking up the road, I hear a car approach from behind me. It went past, not quick or slow. It's an older green SUV with a fresh registration plate. Probably an import. I thought nothing of it. Then I heard it come back, driving past me for the second time, now very slow. I could clearly see 2 men sitting in the front seats wearing a baseball cap, each, and sunglasses. I assumed they were gamekeepers. even though the cars have a crest on the hood and both the doors. As I hike a fair amount, I knew these things. I see them around quite a bit. They would also not be driving a car like this. They have jeeps, which are more suitable for here. Still, I felt no discomfort and again thought nothing of it. Then, my trail left the asphalt road and began snaking in the woods again. I walked ahead, gazing at trees and whatnot. Then I suddenly felt the strange sensation that somebody or something is behind me. An engine sound was becoming more and more clear as well. At this point, the trail was quite narrow, but if, for whatever reason, you want to drive a car on it, you could not. Now I turn around. The SUV is right in my face. It's an arm's length away from me, and it just stopped as I had. I look at the driver, who is staring back at me. I calmly said, "What's wrong? Shall I let you go?" In a polite tone as the windows rolled down. He did not speak though. Instead, began to slowly reverse. Now, I'm uncomfortable. He soon disappears behind a curve. Now I was very scared. I also noticed that he was alone in the car, not like before. I listened intently, still standing, since I wasn't sure what was going on. By this point, I was not scared, but there was a faint feeling of unease in the air, and bad thoughts began gathering in the back of my mind. I now heard the car. It was stopping just behind the curve. I heard the door open and shut, but nothing from that point on. I turned around and began walking towards my destination at a much faster pace than before. Now I was a bit scared. I didn't understand why he didn't answer. I didn't get why he reversed without saying a single word. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I had no desire to ask him again why, or to see him for that matter. I had just walked out of there with these unpleasant thoughts, slightly out of sight to them. I'd been drinking a lot of water, so I had to pee. I saw a perfect spot, a narrow path off the trail that led quite clearly to a little hunting tower. I walked over to the tower, put my bag down, and began peeing. I was also interested in checking Google Maps to see where I was, but since there is no signal, I decided to check the map. I also had a sip of water. I had been camping there for a good few minutes before I decided to look back at the trail. Now right before I get to the main trail, I thought to myself how extremely quiet it was. No wind, no noise of any kind. Absolutely nothing. This made me realize just a moment later how alone I was. Except for the man who was standing maybe 50 meters away from me on the trail, in the direction I was heading. I only saw this as soon as I stepped back onto the trail. Now the moment that I looked at him, I was instantly chilled to the bone. He was dressed in tactical clothing, with a baseball cap on his head. The only reason he was standing still, I believe, was a moment of surprise that I appeared when I did, and that he didn't expect me to appear from there. At this point, I was fully and utterly alarmed. In his hand, he was holding a hunting rifle that had a scope on it. Now, had this happened without the incident with the SUV, I would have probably kept on walking, thinking he's a hunter. However, in light of the strange encounter, from which the second man was missing, something in me snapped immediately. In hindsight, I now know that it's illegal to hunt here. I figured in the matter of 2 seconds that I was going to sprint through the woods until exhaustion, towards and past the tower, as it seemed natural to do at the time. If there was no malicious intent on this man's behalf, or the other, he'll just think I'm an idiot and forget about me. If correct, this is the best decision I've ever made in my life. And for God's sake, he began running towards me, adrenaline blossoming within me. I began sprinting away. I sprinted past the tower deep to the bushes, not sparing my legs as I was wearing shorts and a thermal jumper. I crashed through the branches, small trees, slipping on several occasions. I really did sprint until I was out due to exhaustion. It's been several kilometers now. I even come across some smaller trails but didn't even bother to check them. My pulse was 1,000,000,000 times a minute. I began checking my phone for a signal, but there's nothing. I was really angry at myself for not memorizing the license plate. I began to power walk, but still off the trail straight ahead, in a direction that I knew would sooner or later lead me to the wood's end. When my phone got a signal, I began to immediately relay the story to different people, saying I was overreacting and that I shouldn't have went there alone. Finally, I reached a trail that led directly to a cute little town that borders this rather large forest. It felt like an eternity, but I walked the last kilometer to the main square, took off my jumper, putting it in my bag. At least I looked a little different now. From far away, I waited for a bus that took me to my car, anxiously. After the bus ride, during which I studied each car on the road, I walked back to my car, get in, and drove home. I now called the gamekeeper's forest office. I inquire about what's happened and if they've had any cars in the service, like the ones I've come across. They do not. Their gamekeepers also don't work in pairs. 99% are alone. I told them this and they took me very seriously. I left the office and never went back to that place again. So back in 2015, I had the choice of getting a dog or a smartphone. I'd never had a dog in my life, or a decent smartphone coming to think of it. I'd been saving up for a while regardless, but decided to side with getting a dog. My dad knew a fella who had a couple of border collies that recently had a litter, so we drove out, and the dude gave me the last puppy. Enter Bailey. A couple of weeks after he got his shot, I started walking him. My parents figured I was going to be hanging out at some local park with my new pup, so I could get him to socialize, but no. I chose instead to take him around the perimeter of a nearby farm, to keep the farm dog in him. I've been sneaking out to this farm for years now. The farmer was my old friend. My uncle grew up working with him, so I knew if I was ever caught, I could just drop their name. On either side of the farm was some thick woodland, which nobody ever given me any reason to be wary of. Honestly, they probably should have though. So it's a sunny afternoon. It's been pouring down all week. Bailey was itching for a good walk. I take him to the farm as usual. We start making our way around the woods from east side to west of the farm. Everything's quiet. But Bailey, she keeps on darting away to explore more. He's a puppy. It's what they do, of course. I've been calling his name for some time now, all the way around the field. We're about halfway past the woods. I could see the roof of the farmhouse over the next hill. Bailey's been pulling constantly, going through the bushes along the way. As we're here, I suddenly hear a man calling my dog by his name. Like this dude I don't know is calling my dog by name. I knew it wasn't the farmer because I'd met him at family events like barbecues, etc. So I knew what his voice sounded like. I go completely silent, but the guy keeps on calling my dog. It seems like he's deep into the woods, moving perhaps. He's calling my dog with an excited tone in his voice, which creeps me out. Bailey, meanwhile, is completely ignoring the guy. Now I'm like a tiny girl. I'm only 18. The most experiences I have in combat is a month of taekwondo when I'm 11. I don't have a mobile phone. If that guy works out where I am, I'm screwed. And if Bailey decides to go after him, I'm especially screwed. I'm not letting any psycho get his hands on my puppy. I can either run to the farm, which isn't far away, or back down through the fields towards my home. I pick up my dog, begin sprinting across an open field. Behind me, I hear someone emerge from the woods, but I'm already over the fence, sprinting back home with my puppy under my arm. I get home and tell my mum. She brushes it off as a drunk guy. Great. A few weeks later, I'm at my uncle's house, and the farmer walks in. I told my uncle what happened, so he brings this up. The farmer asks exactly which woods I've been close to, and that some of his clothes had gone missing around that area. He put it down to strong winds, but now he's not sure. I take him and my uncle to the exact spot the next day, and all three of us go in and find a completely wrecked campsite. There's no clothes or anything, but the tent has collapsed on itself. There's no fire, no empty gas canister that you'd use, no anything. We reported it to the police, but as always, nothing ever comes of it. Except that I got a phone not long after that. The thing that scares me most is how that he was calling my dog by its name, knowing that I wouldn't come, but an innocent puppy might and lure me into danger. I was somewhere in the 11 to 10 range. I'm now 25, and my family and I were camping in North Conway, NH. My parents were cooking breakfast, and I went to play in the woods nearby. All of a sudden, this little boy around my age seems to appear out of nowhere from the woods. But being young, I just assumed he was camping nearby. We talked. He told me about how him and his parents are out there a lot, and they have a lot of stuff at their campsite. He went on to tell me about how fun it was, all the things we could do there. I said to him, "What's the fun stuff you're talking about?" He said his dad kept a lot of beer and a lot of guns. He then inquired if I'd like to come and see this with his dad. Being young and stupid, I initially said yes. And now I follow him down the path. My mother catches a glimpse of me walking away with this strange boy and jogs towards us yelling. I told her that I was going with the kid to see his dad's guns. She yanks me away immediately. Now it seems pretty innocent, if left there, but as we're going out that day, we took the road that ran parallel and overlooked most of the campground. Now as I'm looking over there was absolutely nothing where that dog trail led to. It was barely a trail, and went straight into a thickly wooded area, clearly not at all part of the camping grounds. Who knows what lies up there? I'm just glad that I never found out for myself. I have a friend who is a trail ranger. Basically, a ranger who can't get you into trouble. He told me about this time he was gathering illegally placed wildlife cameras and knocking down hunting stands, feeders, and blinds with another actual ranger. The other ranger wasn't feeling so well, so he said he was going to head back as this 1 hour ATV ride. The friend finished up the last one when he heard voices. Keep in mind, he's far off the beaten path. He called out and nobody replies. As it was getting dark, he started to head back and found that his ATV wouldn't start. He then noticed that the battery was not connected anymore. He reconnected it and started to drive, but it wasn't going fast at all. It was actually less than a mile later that it died. He radioed back basically saying, "Guys, I need someone to come pick me up." They told him that they would be an hour. He asked if the other guy got back and they said no. He settled down, started a fire, but not long after I heard voices again. It's dark, he's not happy. The voices sound like an argument now. Somebody was angry and yelling at someone else who was scared. He called out and said if anyone needs help. The voices didn't seem to care. He guessed it had been less than 1,000 feet away. He radios again, and they said they're having trouble finding what path he might be on and haven't left yet. He asks them to just get the other ranger to tell them about where they are, because he left with the iPad that had the map on it, and they still hadn't got back. About 3 minutes go by, he hears the voices again. He decides to walk to them, hoping maybe they can stop being drunk idiots and maybe have a map. He walked in their direction, but the voice seemed to be getting further as he gets closer. Finally, after 20 minutes, he gave up and walks back. He gets a radio call, and they said the other guy was found passed out, covered in vomit, and was being taken to hospital, but he crossed off everywhere they had found a stand, so they'd have a general idea where he is. The radio died, then the voices came back. Bored out of his mind, he decides to listen to what they're arguing about and picked up things like, "Well, it wasn't yours to take, you better do," and so on. His guess was that the hunters were arguing over a kill. Then he heard something that really shocked him. Then silence. He hears a gunshot. He doused his fire and hid. After that, he hears nothing. Just his breathing for the next half an hour until he saw ATV lights. He told the guy picking him up everything and they called back. They had people looking for 3 hours and find nothing. They came back the next day with police and dogs. After about an hour, A shallow grave was discovered with a long dead man who had clearly been shot in the face. The thing is, it's a skeleton, been there for years. So either the argument he had heard just ended with a bang and both parties went home, or he somehow heard a murder from years ago. My cousin is with the Forest Service in the Montana and Wyoming area, and I decided to go up there with her to literally test the waters. She does hydrology and has to ride out into the middle of nowhere to test streams and snow runoff to ensure that there's no contaminants. So I thought that sounded fun and wanted to do a bit of a tour with her. We were going to have to camp out there for 2 nights, so we packed up all our gear in saddlebags and started out. The first day and night was amazing. Beautiful scenery, air quality is the finest. It really is so peaceful out there. I love that area and wish I could go up there more often. Anyway, we started out on the second day and my cousin said, "You want to see something weird?" I said, "Yeah, of course." So now she's leading me out to this tiny ravine. We ended up travelling about 2 hours away from our actual path we had laid out on. At the very end of this fold in the land, she dismounts and tells me to get off my horse too. We tie them up in this gorgeous little clearing. She tells me to follow this tiny wildlife patch and bring our little rechargeable radio. It is one of those where you can plug it in or wind it up. It also acts as a lantern if you really need it. So I do, and out in the middle of nowhere, there is a huge coil of wire sticking out at the ground. The wire itself was not weirdly large, like some buried transmission wire, but small, like 10 or 12 gauge wiring for a home. It trailed off into the brush and trees, so naturally, I decided to follow the thing out of curiosity. My cousin trails behind me as I do. Now after coming straight out of the ground, the wire comes across some trees and back to the ground again, snaking around some rocks and finally deadens in an outlet. The outlet it is mounted on the side of a desk. It looks like a school teacher's desk from when I was growing up, with a metal base and wood top, no chair, nothing, just an outlet and a desk. I'm staring confused as hell at this desk in the middle of a forest when my cousin takes a radio, pulls out the cord, plugs it into the outlet. It then lit up and started blaring out static. The wire's being fed from somewhere. Now the place where we are had no road access, no buildings for literally miles on end, and away from everyone. Yet, there's a live power outlet. Weird as hell. I'm an ex-ranger. We had a group of frat boys making way too much noise. We come by twice. And at the second stop, I told them, "This is your last warning. Not only is it rude for other campers to be so loud, it's exceptionally dangerous. Everyone knows that local mountain lions are attracted to noises at night, and these ghost cats, as they're called, can creep right up on you without ever making a sound." I told them, "Whatever you do, don't leave your tent tonight. Don't make another sound." I go back to the station, grab the lion pelt from the interp center, and the night vision goggles. Once they were all in their tents, we crept up in the campsite and made fake lion tracks everywhere. I then pulled the jeep forward as though we were arriving upon the scene and get out. I turned on my mag light and illuminated the silhouette of the lion pelt. Because I was moving quickly, the shadow of the lion appeared to be moving. At this point, they're losing it. They're screaming there's another one and stay in their tents, and then let's get out of here. At that point, we turned off the flashlights, grabbed the lion pelt in the darkness and jumped in the jeep and sped off. Just after sunrise, they began peeking out of their tents. No one was brave enough to get out of their tents, and when they saw the giant paw prints everywhere, they were screaming. I was a lone recreation ranger in a small district in southern Idaho. The nearest town from guard station was about an hour and a half away by car. After moving to the guard station, the solar power was not working. I hadn't slept for about a month due to various factors. There were bats in the cabin, there was something walking on the deck at night. The woods always had an eerie feeling to them. I eventually managed to get used to all this, so now I'm about 2 months into the seasonal job, and I started to hear something walking and scratching on the deck at night, perhaps even on the door. Now this district was known for its badgers and beavers, so I don't think much of it. When leaving the cabin at night, I always had an eerie feeling as though I was being watched. One night, I was returning home from my grocery run, and I had a bad feeling. At the time, I didn't have my shotgun in the vehicle. After stepping out of the vehicle, I looked to the right of the cabin, about 50 feet away from my front door. All I see is these two eyes about 4 foot into the air. I yell, "Get the hell out of here," but the eyes only crouch down, getting closer. Now I know it's a large animal. I tossed a piece of firewood in the general area, and the creature leaps back a bit but didn't make a sound. I tossed 4 or 5 more pieces at the creature, yet it inches towards me. At this point, I fumbled with the keys. Of course, the solar power was out again. I managed my way inside, get my shotgun. I went outside. The creature's now a bit closer. Still could not get a good look at it with my crappy headlamp. I loaded the shotgun, continuing to throw wood. Finally, the creature walks back into the brush. That night, I drank about 4 IPAs and slept with my shotgun. In the morning, trail crew came up and we found mountain lion tracks all over the porch. After that, I always heard the rocking chair move and someone or something walking on my porch, but I never found any tracks after this. Considering that it's always muddy up there, I thought it was weird to not find any tracks. Now I've been stalked by mountain lions before, and never had that eerie feeling that I did when in those woods. I was 18 years old, a high school senior, and was about 3/4 of the way through the year. I had moved that year and switched to a school about 30 minutes away from where I used to go. I stayed in touch with a few people from my old school and got invited to go camping with a few of them over Memorial Weekend. I invited 2 girls and 1 guy from my new school to come hang out for a night and met them in the closest town from the campsite, about 40 minutes away. The guy Jeremy hopped in the car and the girls followed me up, and we get to the campsite without incident. The campsite was 30 minutes away from any human signs of life outside of a dirt road. The night started off fine with everyone getting completely trashed. At about 12:30, things started to die down as half of us were puking and ready to sleep. Now a lot of the night is still a blur, but I remember climbing into a tent where there's 5 of us in it, 3 guys and 2 girls. It's around 2:30 AM. I was awoken by the sound of a shotgun. I was still very drunk, had a hard time processing anything, but in my drunken state, I figured it as one of the people I was camping with being a dick. One of the guys, Brent, had stayed sober the entire night, and had brought his shotgun up with him, so I figured it as him being a prick to everyone drunk. I check my phone and go back to sleep. I fell asleep at what I think was around 3 AM. I was awoken by somebody bawling their eyes out, and I'm still having a hard time processing anything. After about 5 minutes, I realise it's Brent, and I stumble out of my tent followed by Jeremy. I walk out and see Brent is bleeding profusely from his nose and mouth. I run over to him stumbling. I am then hit in the head with a rock and knocked unconscious. Everything from this point forward is from Jeremy's point of view. Jeremy to this day is my best friend, and has told me his version of this story many times. He says I pass by a tree and a large man lunges out and smashes my face with a rock. After hitting me, the man lunges at Jeremy, tackling him straight to the ground. Jeremy at the time was 5'8" and 140 pounds, but this guy was 6'4", 280. Jeremy is being choked to death by this monster of a man. He now hears another gunshot. Sarah managed to find a pistol Brent had also brought with him, firing a shot missing the man. It scared him though, and he now rushes off into the woods. They just let him go, and Jeremy drove me and Brent to hospital. I had 3 broken teeth and a severe concussion, and Brent had part of his tongue mutilated with a knife and broken nose. Now Brent has never talked to me or any of my other friends from that trip about exactly what happened. When he was outside alone with that man, refusing to give the police description as well. This man was never caught, and I've never been in that deep forest again. This was in 2005, I should mention. I'm a park warden. I spend most of my shifts alone, working 5:30 PM to 2:30 AM in the Canadian wilderness. We have about 300 campsites, a handful of beaches, and the infrastructure that goes with them. It just so happens that my park is closed during winter, which is a standard thing in Canada. So there's no staff in the park from mid-October to early April. Now years ago, a man decided to end it all via a sawed-off shotgun down by the river on one of the beaches in late November. No one found him until the spring melt. This beach is at the furthest north point of the park. It's pretty isolated, but as it has a beach, it requires at least 1 patrol an evening. I was down in the showers at the beach at around 7 PM on a very overcast day. I was checking the supplies in the first aid kits and signing off on the fire extinguishers. The weather was blah, so there were no campers out or patrols anywhere near the beach. And the parking lot was empty except for my cruiser. All of a sudden, A feeling of intense panic washes over me. I booked it to my cruiser, get in, slam the door shut and take a few deep breaths in and wait for the feeling to pass. After a minute or two, I get back to business, but this time sitting in my locked car, filling out blinders and work logs. Suddenly, a huge dark shape moves across my driver's side window and I scream and jump back. My immediate thought is that somebody's been lurking and was about to try and smash the glass door open. Sure as hell it is empty, not a soul around, but you can bet your life that I left all the further maintenance tasks on the neck of the park patrol doing it in the day shift. I floored it out of there. Now it's not probably the scariest or most shocking story, but it rattled me hard, and now I refuse to do foot patrols down there at night. I was somewhat popular at the time. I had around 4 very close friends, Rose, Lynn, Noah and Zach. These were the main ones. Now we went out on many adventures around that time. Camping, road trips, the beach. Noah's family was pretty wealthy, and all of our families were pretty lenient with rules. One day, the summer before 8th grade, we went on a camping trip with Lynn's older sister, Margaret, and Zach's older brother, Todd. So there's 7 of us. Lynn, Zach, and I was the 13th. Noah and Rose are the 14th. Margaret and Todd were both 17. We decided to go camping in a nearby forest, around 20 miles from Noah's home. It's pretty much the middle of nowhere. Noah's house and his neighbours were the closest homes. There were no signals for phones or any other electronics out there. We get to the spot easily without problems, and we make camp. The girls in one tent and the boys in another. Maybe it's a bad idea to have 17s, 13 to 16 with no phones in the woods. But our parents are lenient, like I said, and confident we should be fine since the woods were not known for anything dangerous or bad. So we get set up, go swimming by a nearby lake, come back and make dinner over a fire about 20 feet away from the tent, which are about 4 feet away from each other. We have s'mores and do all those stupid camping things before Lynn and Margaret decide they're gonna sleep. They left Todd, Rose, and Noah and Zach and I joking around telling scary stories. Then Margaret wakes up annoyed and tells us that whoever is messing with the side of the tent to stop. Keep in mind, no one's left the group, and the tents were far enough away from each other to not have anyone near them. She explains that somebody keeps touching the side of the tent, running something along it. We dismiss her. Todd states it's probably a tree branch, and Rose and I decide to sleep as well. So we head back to the tent. Lynn is asleep, and we settle in. Me closest to the opening, Margaret next to Lynn, who is at the opposite side of the tent, and Rose in between Margaret and I. I manage to fall asleep easily within 5 minutes until I wake up suddenly, for what seems like no reason. I now go and check on my phone. I still brought it, and it had a portable charger that was just to take pictures. And it's literally the middle of the night. At 2:15, I look around. My eyes are getting adjusted to the darkness, trying to figure out why I'm awake. A tapping sound on the tent was the first thing I noticed. and a soft giggle. It sounded somewhat deep, like a male voice, but I couldn't be sure. Now after what felt like an hour, it was probably a minute or two, the tapping and giggling stops. I was convinced it's my imagination, or maybe one of the boys trying to prank us, or even a tree branch like Todd suggested earlier. Telling myself it was a tree branch and lack of sleep. I fell asleep until Rose woke up at around dawn. She also woke me. Everyone's awake, and we decided to hike a little. We decided to go into 2 groups because we planned on spending the night again, and we didn't want anyone messing with our stuff. Even though these woods weren't popular with camping, we didn't want to risk it. Now Margaret, Lynn, Rose and I left to go hiking for a couple of hours, while the boys opted to stay behind and fish, swim and cook. We hiked for about 2 hours, and when we came back, the boys are not at the campsite. Now we're annoyed. Margaret went down to the lake with Lynn to find them. Rose and I made our way back to the tents, and I'll be honest and say I screamed and almost wet myself. The tents are slashed. I inspect it closer after regaining composure before I was usually the more collective one of the two. It seemed to be made with a knife. Our tents were made of a pretty thin material, but it's very hard to cut into, so effort would have had to been there. The boys, Margaret and Lynn, came running up to our screams, and were obviously startled. We decided to pack up and head home early, because for one, the tents were ripped too much to use again comfortably, and we're very scared. Even more so when Todd announces that his tyres are slashed. We're all freaking out, obviously. There was no cell service. Todd's tyres were slashed. And there was no way any of us wanted to stay any longer. Luckily, Todd reported that Margaret's tyres looked fine, and she noticed that she could then take Noah and Lynn, drop them off to call 911 and call their parents, and come back for us. She drove a car, and there wasn't enough room for more than 3 people, as the back's filled up with the camping gear. So now, it's Zach, Todd, Rose and I left at the camping grounds. We decided to begin a hike back towards the main road, so Margaret wouldn't have to drive so far. Also, Rose and I refused to stay anywhere near the camping area, so we began hiking. My phone died. The last time I looked at it, it was 1 in the afternoon. Zach and Rose both had working phones and constantly updated us on how far we had been walking. I began to hear branches snapping from behind us, closer to the trees than we walked. And I got more and more paranoid as time went on. I told Todd. He seemed to get much more wary of the surroundings, constantly looking over his shoulder. We had been walking for about 30 minutes. Margaret was probably at Noah's house or almost there when Todd screamed run. Naturally, I looked behind my shoulder before running. There's 3 hooded figures running towards us. 2 had knives, and they're all at least 6'3" or so. Todd was 6'1", but I strongly doubted he could defend us against them. Even though it's broad daylight, I couldn't make out any facial features. Now they're all over 200 pounds. The shortest one was probably 6'2", but they all had masks on. We began running, and 3 of the guys finally gave up, and decided we weren't worth terrorizing or capturing because we lost them. We make it back to the main road where we waited, walking quickly, constantly looking over shoulders in fear until Margaret arrived. We told the police everything. They searched the woods nearby and never found any evidence what we had been talking about, or even that we had been there. Now I really don't know what would have happened if they caught us. I'm fairly tall, around 5'10" during this time, but only 125 pounds. Rose is a lot smaller though, about 5'1". And Zach was barely 5'9" at the time. Now I'm so thankful that I told Todd about them. I have no doubt they would have been able to catch us if he hadn't been looking over his shoulder constantly. I'm so glad they never caught us to do God knows what. It's obvious they intended to harm us. How badly? I don't ever want to know. When I was younger, about 10 years ago, I gotten into bird watching. I was about 12, so it wasn't really official by any means. I was just some kid that liked to sneak up on birds, grab a quick picture, and look them up in books. I decided to start this hobby with making a list, with pictures I'd printed from the library, or of native birds in my region. Every weekend, I'd be wandering around my neighborhood in search of new birds, with a few ponds and a large creek in my area. I found quite a few within my first few weeks. However, there was one bird that was sort of a white whale due to its rarity in the area, a black vulture. We have tons of vultures in the area. Well, turkey vultures. They're common, but far fewer black vultures. It's a bit hard to tell the difference if they're flying too high. The best way to determine which vulture is what is to do with how much grey-white is under their wings. If they get closer, you can eventually make out the red head of the turkey vultures, of which I did so often, disappointingly. Now unfortunately, I cannot remember the exact date, or what month it was even, but one weekend, I decided to spend the next few days searching high and low for the black vulture. I went climbing all over the small wire fencing around a nearby bushy area, as usual, and searched. Now usually, you had to be lucky to find scavenger birds on roadkill. Besides a road, there are so many small things around, like 2 lanes that mirrored the creek nearby through some foliage. So I just cut across a sort of mini forest, heading in that direction. As much as it made me sad to see a dead deer or possum, it was a common sight on this road, as both sides are now open, with trees and undergrowth almost choking it. There are some parts of the road that almost become a tunnel due to leaves intertwining above. It's incredibly easy for a deer or some other animal to jump out in front of a car in the dark, not realizing it's too late. I didn't have much luck. There are far fewer crows or anything nearby. I see a few ducks swimming in the creek besides me. Nothing big. It started getting late now, but the sun's up. Despite the dangers of walking down a forest road in the dark, I was determined to stay out as long as possible. I decided to reach a small park area at the end of the road, and then I'd be making my way back. I went under a small tunnel of leaves, back out on the other side, delighted to see the familiar shape of a large bird circling in the sky. It was just the right shape and size to be a vulture, yet I had no hope of checking for the greyness of its feathers. Sunlight is limited. Instead, I was stuck following it as it slowly began to sink lower and lower. After about 10 or so minutes, it landed. I then carefully snuck forward, casually and cautiously avoiding anything that could alert the bird of my presence. I now had sunk low to the ground, realizing that the bird had landed in a small clearing at the far end of the park. It's just a small, open field, slightly tilted down a hill, with the parking lot on top. I've been there before, as it's a fun spot for kids to roll down because how steep it is. I approached from the bottom, excitement brimming, when I heard several squawks and shrieks of other birds. Now black vultures are far more aggressive than turkeys. I was hoping to catch a spat. I get to the edge of the clearing, pull out my binoculars. Two things hit me at once. One, I found it odd that they're in the middle of the park, rather than closer to the road, where you'd normally assume to find some roadkill, though I reason that things can die anywhere, even in the middle of a park. However, it smelled awful. The scent was rather light, but I've been known to have a really sensitive nose. But something about this didn't smell right. Not like any other roadkill I've smelled before. When I put the binoculars to my eyes, I expected to see a deer corpse and two birds fighting. Never in a million years did I think I'd see a corpse of a complete different kind. The birds were there. I remembered the faint fang of excitement I still had, recognizing the proud head of the black vulture, before the image of it sitting on the chest of a naked woman sucked all the life out of me. I was frozen. I could not look away. My throat tightened with vomit. I could not look away. The bird had done surprisingly little to her. She had what appeared to be cuts, but most of her waist was intact. What wasn't the bird's rat? It was a horrifying sight, one that I will never forget. I can see the image so clear now. She was pale, with blonde hair. I sat there, stupidly, for who knows how long, as the sun began to sink over the trees. This was the time before cell phones were common, and I had the quiet hike back home now. I realize now that I'm in shock, and I could only move when the sudden fear that whatever did this could be directly behind me forces itself upon me. I begin to slowly waddle backwards into the trees, not taking my eyes off the body for a second. I did not want to turn around. For some reason, I was so scared somebody would be behind me that I just backed up forever. Maybe nothing would happen. It was now dusk, and suddenly, high beams appear from over the top of the hill. I then heard the screech of tires as a car wheeled out, and I listened to it veer off left away down the road, opposite to the direction of which I'm heading. That was the last straw. I ran the entire way back the second that I could no longer hear it. I crashed through at least a mile of brush, and while I was smart enough to have some boots on, my arms were not covered and began bleeding. I stopped. I paused midway through the brush by my home, realizing that, embarrassingly, I wet myself in fear. I then crawled through people's yards to get to my house. Now the horror didn't completely end there. I was home alone until past midnight, as my mum worked late at a diner. To this day, I have regrets as to why I did not immediately call the police. I instead lock all the doors, double check, take a shower, and lock myself in my bedroom. I'd fallen asleep, somehow, by the time my mum came home. I confronted her in the morning. At least, by that time, when we made the call together, the body had already been found. They took my statement, but we never got any calls back. So I was out there, searching for a creature amongst animals, but the monster that I did find, or almost found me should I say, will forever haunt me and be far more terrorizing. About 2 years ago, I finally moved into a brand new home in a brand new estate in Australia. I was one of the first to have a finished building in the area, and was able to finally grace my independence. The first few weeks went by as normal. During that time, I'd often take walks alone with the dog in the afternoons and roam around the estate area. All the roads around us had been practically completed, and all the other properties were marked out. But no other houses were built excluding one, directly opposite mine. The home appeared finished, but there was no driveway laid yet. From what I gathered, no one lived there. Up to the left of my home, roughly a few hundred meters away, was a field with a huge hill upon it. I later found out that the whole area was council property. Not only was no one allowed to build up there, but the whole hill was basically a no-go zone. For whatever reason, the council just didn't want people up there, so the whole area was surrounded by a huge fence. The only other notable feature in the area was a small abandoned farmhouse with a shed a few kilometers down the road. I knew nothing about it, and often went walking there with the dog, as it gave me something mild to explore amongst the vast nothingness that I lived around. The entire place was abandoned and completely uninhabitable, but still interesting nonetheless. About a month or two after moving in, I awoke one morning to the sound of a violin. It was extremely distant and quite haunting. I actually enjoyed it, assuming the neighbours opposite me had moved in. Excited that I finally had people to talk to, I looked out the curtain, seeing that the house is still vacant as it ever was. I get dressed. By the time I look out, the violin ceased. Now this happened roughly every second day for every week. The violin would wake me up, then disappear about a minute later. I'd ignored it to the point my curiosity got the better of me. The next morning, when I heard the violin play again, I instantly jumped out of bed, threw on my dressing gown, shot to the front door. I look, and there up on the hill, someone's playing a violin. It was barely light, but the person appeared very tall from the distance I was at. They are doing what can only be described as a waltz type walk, spinning slowly in a circle as they are playing. I took my eyes off the person and walked over to pick up the morning paper. In the 10 seconds it takes me, I hear the violin stop. When I look up, I notice the figure was no longer playing or dancing, but now standing still, most likely looking in my direction. It was so dark I couldn't make out any more. We both stood there for half a minute, not moving before the creeps got the better of me, so I hidden back inside. After that morning, things started happening. On my walks, I began to notice footprints on the surrounding properties that were not made by me, that I also hadn't seen before, which I was just assuming were from people walking up from other houses and down the road. I never awoke to the violin, but I swore I could hear someone walking on the street next to my bedroom windows in the early mornings. However, I never saw a thing. There were other things generally, like random tools such as spades and rakes lying around the area that I guessed were left there by construction crews, none of which I ever saw. I then started getting calls at work and would immediately be hung up on. I also stopped walking up to the farmhouse that was abandoned, as the experience with the violin had shaken me. One night, as I'm heading to bed, I turn off the television in the living room and again could hear the faint sound of a violin playing. However, it sounded more muffled and somewhat rehearsed. I froze. A cold chill flowed through me instantaneously, considering that it's about midnight and not the usual time I'd hear it playing. I went to the front window and peeked out, and there was a light in the house opposite mine. It was clearly a candle, as I could see the dim light flickering in the empty window, and music sounded as though it was coming from an old record player. But in the 10 minutes I watched, I never saw any movement from inside. I moved away from the window, sufficiently freaked out now. Another 5 minutes pass. I hear the music stop abruptly. I look out the window again and notice that the light's out now. I never saw anyone. I began to become unsettled in the house, often inviting friends over, but of course, nothing would ever happen when someone else was with me. I never bothered to tell any of my friends, as without evidence, they'd think I was crazy. But nothing compared to what happened next. In my living area, the desk sits right next to a small window which looks out to my fence surrounding my property. The steel fence is literally an arm's length away from the home and about 6 feet tall, so I figure that, unlike most other windows, I'd never need to cover this one with a sheet or blanket because no one's seeing in. I usually had headphones on. When I played, I always had the lights off. For no other reason than I prefer to play games in the dark. So one night as I'm gaming, I get up, walk to the dark side of the kitchen, grab a beer out of the fridge. It was dead silent, excluding the faint sound of my headphones. As I closed the fridge and turned to face the desk, I saw directly out of the window two very, very faint lights. I didn't even catch on to it immediately, starting to walk back to the desk, fixated on the small glowing balls. It wasn't until I had my nose almost pressed against the glass that I realised the two lights weren't lights at all. They're eyes. So now, there's a set of eyes sitting just above the fence line staring wide open at me. They don't blink. They don't move. My entire body locks up. All I can do is stare back as my brain is still comprehending. Why is there a person staring at me in the scariest possible way I can ever imagine? I don't know what happened. Either my head kicked into gear, or my muscles loosened, but my body automatically collapsed and I fell to the ground, scurrying to hide against the wall, away from the window. I could hear my heart beating through the carpet like a drum, as I lay as flat as possible, as my mind is still processing the sheer severity of the situation. A violin begins playing. The violin is haunting me with a tune that's beginning to emanate, except this time, it's directly outside my window, and much louder than I've heard it before. Now the lights are still off. I wanted to get up to turn my PC screen off so I can't be seen, but my whole body is not cooperating. Not only was the sound of the instrument extraordinarily loud, it almost sounded as though it's being played with frustration, notes being frequently missed, strings are screeching now. The pace of it was getting faster and faster. By this time, my dog Jeb out in the backyard had picked up on the situation, registering the unfamiliar sound, giving one solitary deep bark. The violin instantly stopped. The house was dead silent once again. I was still froze to the carpet, and it wasn't until Jeb gave a second menacing bark that I heard the figure outside starting to walk away directly into where I am. Once the first footstep hits the ground, I instantly thought of the welfare of my best mate, and finally, my head connected with extremities and my entire body kicked into overdrive. I left from the ground and slid across the laminated floor to the back door where Jeb was standing, staring into the backyard. I ducked, keeping low, and quietly unlocked the door. Now usually by doing so, I would notify Jeb that he's allowed inside, but when the door opened up, he didn't move an inch, and he was completely fixated on the pitch black backyard. Everything told me not to go outside. There was no chance I was letting anything happen to my dog. I move out slowly, Jeb behind. I put my hand under his collar in an attempt to back him towards the home. Now Jeb is a pure Labrador and weighs a ton and does not want to move. It takes a sheer force to pull him in any direction you want him to go. Jeb's not going anywhere, at least not right now. I yank at him. He emits a bark that I've never heard him do before. A deep bellowing one that somewhat elevates my nerves to an all-time high. We both just stood there, waiting for some form of reply. I can't remember how long, but we both froze there, and eventually, I heard footsteps from around the side of the home, beginning to create dissonance. But not a simple walk. Whoever did so was dancing in a circle. The footsteps are even making a beat as they drift away into the distance, away from the home. Once I couldn't hear anything, Jeb licks his lips, gave me a look, and wanders back inside. I follow, locking the door behind me, and spending the night reverting to my childhood self, hiding under my bed with my dog. I do not sleep a wink. That's the last time I ever saw or heard the violin player. The following morning, the sun comes up. I call into work sick and call the police. They launch their investigation. They found that there were so many footprints in the dirt, it would be impossible to figure out who's who. The only thing I could tell them was that they had to be over 6 foot to stare into my fence at me. They also tell me that they've never received a report of anyone playing a violin in the area or near the fenced-off hill. I essentially looked like an insane person, but the officers were very nice about the whole thing, offering to patrol the area for the next few nights, which helps put my mind at ease. Nothing else happened since then. A little background on the events I'm about to write about. This all happened in mid-October. My family owns about 160 acres out in the middle of nowhere. The closest neighbour is a friend who we let rent the pasture for his cattle when he needs to. Some friends and I had decided we wanted to build a cabin out here that we could hang out at. So one weekend, one of my friends and I loaded up a tractor that we're renting from his dad and headed out there. It was just me and him that weekend, as everyone else was busy. We got there a little late, since it took a while to get everything loaded up and packed for the weekend. He sat about setting up our tent. I made fire. As I did so, I made an odd discovery. There was a phone book from a few towns over, still in a plastic sleeve, right next to our fire pit. I pick it up and show my friend. We both enjoyed scaring ourselves, and I made the comment that we're not alone out here. We both laughed at it. Later in the night, we're sitting around the campfire talking, and there's a big bright moon above us, with a bit of a breeze that made the leaves wither. There's a weird rustling sound which was creepy but added to our atmosphere. We notice, however, someone crossing through the middle of the field, their body just visible from the moonlight. At first, it's a little odd. My friend and I discussed for a few seconds if we should confront him, but I made the suggestion that he was probably just taking a shortcut through the field, although I didn't really like it. It wasn't a huge deal. If we caught him doing it again, then we'd confront him, we decided. The rest of the night passed pretty uneventfully. We eventually got in our tent and laid down. We're probably 20 or so feet from the fire pit, which by this point is burning quite low. We spoken for a few minutes, then go silent, trying to fall asleep. As we're laying there, we hear something. It sounded like quiet footsteps walking around the fire pit. We both look at each other silent. Then, we hear a piece of wood get thrown to the fire and it flames up a bit. I grab the shotgun I always keep in the tent and quietly rack it. We heard someone run away, but by the time we got out, they were too far away. The rest of the weekend was pretty quiet, and the events of the first night seemed kind of dreamy to us. We just cleared out the area of the cabin and cut stacked where the trees were for the firewood. Next weekend, we get out there. My uncle was out there as well, and went to check his game cams. This is where it got much worse for us. My uncle told us that he's annoyed. Someone stole the batteries and SD cards from the cameras. We told him about what happened the weekend before and parted ways. When we got out there, we noticed that quite a bit of our wood we had cut and stacked was already gone. And we were the last people to come out of there, which means someone had come out and had the fire for themselves. When we gone and checked on the tractor, which had been left down there, we found it had been broken into, and the chainsaw which we left in the cabin had been stolen. I don't know anything else that this person or these people have done or been doing, but I will keep you all updated. For a bit of context, I grew up in the middle of farmland in a large 1800s Victorian home. Given its history, there's always been several shacks and barns that once belonged to the builder of the home. There's a highway that sees maybe 3 cars on it during the night, directly across from the highway. About 200 feet inward of a cornfield, there's a shack that I've always found creepy. As kids, myself and friends would dare each other to go inside and look, which always ended up with us going as a team. Nothing scary was ever found, maybe a few broken glasses, metal piles and miscellaneous items. There was no electricity of any sort. That kind of made it very far from being homely. Years go by, the existence of the shack becomes a part of my daily life. However, one particular night, as I'm watching TV, I notice a light going off outside of my window. At first I'm startled, but then I dismiss it as passing cars, simply more frequent than they typically are. An hour passes. It's nearing midnight and the light stays on. This time, I know for sure it's coming from outside. My family was asleep, but me being my pansy 16-year-old self, I need confirmation. Too bad for me, no one wants to check it out. I go alone. I grab my pocket knife and flashlight. The best I could think of with my shaken thoughts was that something had took off into the night. As I neared the highway, the light turns off, almost making me choke on air, but I had to figure out what the hell was going on. I make it to the entrance of the shack, which has no door, and begin to slowly enter, my flashlight scanning the room for any sign of life. What happened next, I'll never forget. 5 feet away from me, there's an odd tattered recliner facing away that my father had tossed in there for future disposal. I shine my light on it because I know I'd seen it rock ever so slightly. As it does, a man stands up from the recliner, saying absolutely nothing. All I can tell was that he's middle-aged, wearing a jacket of sorts. Now, I can't process what's happening. I'm already sprinting across the road, praying that he's not behind me. It felt like years before I could make it to my door, but as I'm about to make it into safety, I decide to look back. He's standing in the road completely still now, no words whatsoever. It's been 7 years since then. The shack still stands, the recliner remains in place. My dad never believed me. I wish someone could share the dread I had when I realised the recliner's facing the window, which is staring directly into my home. I live in a ranch-style home in the middle of Missouri on 2 acres of nothing but woods. We bought the house about 2 years ago. The home was vacant for over 8 months before we purchased it, and the realtors had problems with squatters about 3 months into the house being for sale, but said nothing happened since. My elderly grandmother lives with me as I am her caregiver. It's just the two of us and our dogs. Now, I moved into the house in October of 2016. The first incident occurred in March 2017. We started seeing a bunch of plastic bags and trash around the back of our home, further out than either of us go. Now, I really didn't think much of it, but made a mental note that raccoons or something had gone through our trash. I put some bungee cords on cans to hold the lids down and wrote it off. One night, I was coming home, much later than normal, at about 1:30 AM. All of our land is fenced in, but there is one back gate. Near the back gate, I saw a bunch of trees rustling. There's a lot of wildlife in our area, so I assumed that's what it was, but I got that horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach and decided to check it out. The ground was dry enough that I was able to drive through the yard in my car with my doors locked. I shone my headlights on trees. I then see a man coming running out of them. If that wasn't terrifying enough, he ran straight for the gate as if he knew exactly where it was, opened it and left. I was absolutely terrified, so I called my dad who lives in the area. He explained to me how large the population of homeless people is in our area, and that he'd come over to put a gate up. About 2 weeks after the first incident, I was letting my dogs outside. The one had already went inside, the other was playing hard to get as usual. I began calling out her name. It wasn't even dark outside. After about 3 calls, another voice, distinctly male, started calling out her name. She began barking aggressively and running for the home. I was freaked out, but again, let my family talk me out of making a call to the authorities. About a month passes. My grandmother has a habit of forgetting to close the garage door behind her. Now, at some point at around 11 PM, our neighbour from across the street knocks on our door. He says he was outside smoking, and he saw the 2 men standing in our garage talking. He said as soon as he started walking over, they ran off. What scares me the most about this event is they stole nothing, and there was plenty to steal. We have a brand new refrigerator, leaf blower, power tools, and Grandma leaves the keys in the car. They were just talking. This time I called the police, and they told me in the nicest way possible they couldn't do anything. If there was another incident, to call them, and not to scare the men away. The final incident of 2017 happened probably 3 months after the prior one. We have a sun patch attached to the outside of the home. The door connects to the kitchen, and the outside door to the deck. I don't know if I explained it right, and if anyone wants I can show you pictures, but basically, we left for several hours to go grocery shopping. We come home, and all our deck furniture was stacked on top of each other, and the screen ripped off the sun porch door. I then called the emergency line for our area, and again, there's nothing that can be done. About 2 weeks ago now, we had our white vinyl fence power washed. Because the fence is quite old, a post came off the fence and the company that power washes the fence didn't know how to fix it. We left the post in the front yard against the fence. We come home a couple of days later, and the post was nailed back up, with a smiley face attached to it. I was spooked. Cut to Saturday of last week. My grandmother is able to drive again, but doesn't have her own car. I'm busy working around the home, so she decides to take herself to the doctor. My grandmother leaves the home through our connected door to the garage. I lock it behind her. It never dawns on me to check to make sure she's closed it. About 20 minutes after she leaves, somebody's banging heavily on the door. When I say banging, I mean it appears to be a SWAT team. Someone putting all their force into it. My dogs are going nuts, and I don't know what to think. I start to think maybe Grandma left something and is trying to get my attention, but the little voice in the back of my head says, there's no way she's doing that. Suddenly, it stops and I hear a deep laugh. I get my baseball bat out of my bedroom and lock myself in the bathroom with the dogs. I realise I've left my phone outside the bathroom, but I was too afraid to go outside the bathroom to get it. I took the lid of the tank of the toilet seat, so I had 2 weapons. Nothing happened, and I hid in the bathroom until my grandma was home. Now I know there wasn't some kind of big confrontation or climax, but I know the story's not over yet, and I'm sure these events are connected. I'm going nuts living here. I honestly don't know what to think. I'll update everyone if anything else happens. I'm a park ranger during the daytime, but in my off times I'm an avid hunter and love to go exploring and camping. I was on one particular trip in Alaska that was like no other. I'd gone to one particular area that I love to go fishing in a number of times, and I was planning on spending the week up in an isolated cabin. Now, to get to the cabin you actually had to walk or really trek for miles and miles in snowshoes. During such, it was quite bright during the day and could actually get quite hot, so I had to wear some sunglasses just to stop my eyes burning from the light reflecting. I also brought lots of water because I'd get lots of headaches otherwise. Anyway, the first couple of days on the trip go perfectly normal and I'm having a great time there. Now, when I set in for the 3rd night, I'm awoken by a loud knocking on the door. I think this is really odd because literally no one's out here. Now, I know something's wrong and I go to investigate. I can see quite clearly out of the windows and I don't see anyone at all. Strangely, this made me feel very calm and a little bit slow, if that makes sense. Kind of reminded me of how far away I am from everyone else. I don't think much of it and decide that I need to go back to bed. I do so and all is normal. I'm now coming into the 4th night. I'm heading back from another fishing trip and I feel pretty calm and relaxed. I'm actually very peaceful at this particular moment and happy to be going back and starting my meal. I'm going to be eating one of the fish that I've captured, and I think this is really cool. As I'm doing so, I can hear a loud knock on the door once again. Confused, I go out and grab my knife and go to open the door. I open the door and find no one. But just off, over in the horizon, I can see a tall figure standing there looming. It's very shadowy and hard to see because some snow's picked up, but this is weird. I shout out, "Hey, do you need help?" And the only way I can describe this is that it seemingly melts into the floor. Not like it walks off, it just seems to slowly go down to where I can't see it. I call out to this person again or whatever it is, and again get no reply. The silence becomes deafening and I'm struck with fear now. Then something else is odd. I can't really see any tracks around. I decide to close the door and quickly go out to try and help in case somebody's lost. I realise that it's not likely and improbable, but I guess that's from being a ranger that makes you want to go and investigate and try and help. I head over quickly to the exact spot where this person appeared to be, but I can't find anything. Surely the isolation has really started to get to me. I decide the best thing I can do now is just head back and try and think of home. Now, I've really struggled to fall asleep at night and I've truly tried my best, but something just felt completely off about this encounter. Now, in the early hours of the 5th day, I'm woken up again by a strange knocking. I'm actually pretty irritated and I grab the knife and repeat the procedure. Just as I'm one step from opening the door handle, I hear knocking again on the opposite side of the cabin. Now, I know I'm alone out here and nobody should be around me, and I can feel the muscles becoming tight on my back, like my body's getting prepared for something to come and attack me. I can actually feel my blood pulsating a little bit, which isn't a nice feeling, and it travels up to the top of my neck and my arms. You know when you just get into a heightened state, almost like you know something's there and you're trying your best to stay calm. I then go to investigate the other side of the cabin, and I can't get rid of this strange warm feeling on my body. I go to shout but quickly stop myself, realizing silence is the best thing now and I really need to be observant to figure out what the heck is going on. And immediately it stops. I then hear it from the other side of the cabin and realize something's wrong. Suddenly the wind's picked up and there's knocking on all sides of the cabin. It sounded like lots of people throwing hard cuts at the sides of the cabin constantly, and I almost feel like the whole thing's gonna come down. I go back and sit in the middle of the bed with the knife drawn, not knowing what to do. I can just about see out the windows and no one's there. I ended up covering my ears, closing my eyes, waiting for it to stop. And suddenly it does, almost like I've willed it away. I become very angry suddenly and don't want to be scared and quickly throw the door open and scream, "Hey, whoever's there needs to stop." I rush outside with the knife, ready to have a big fight to the death with God knows what, but there's nothing there. I quickly sprint to one side of the cabin and I find nothing. I then trace my steps and run in a circle and I can't find anything. I then look up expecting to see some kind of rock or at least snow in the ground from where somebody's threw stuff like ice or whatever at the cabin, but there's nothing. Then I can see it. There's tracks leading up to the front of the cabin. Yes, I've got them. I'm very angry, and with the adrenaline surging in my body, I sprint towards the tracks, running in the direction that I saw the figure yesterday. I follow these for a good minute until, suddenly, they stop. The steps completely vanish out of nowhere. I look to the left and right and can't see any tracks whatsoever. I then look around and I can't find anyone. This is very bizarre because I know for a fact that I should have encountered somebody by now. Even if it's just an animal, there should be something, but there's nothing. I start to grow more and more irritated until I take a closer inspection of the tracks. They kind of look almost too big to be a person's, but clearly not a bear because there's not any paw prints. I take a while to try and figure out what these are, but I really can't. They're basically large masses in the snow with kind of points at the end. But clearly it's not a hoof, but God knows what it is. I realise now that I should really cut the trip short, but I don't have a choice other than to go and sleep for a bit, then continue in the morning home. And I don't want to get a reputation for being somebody who's scared of things that might not even be there. So I sprint back into the cabin, I barricade the door and bedroom and fall asleep again. I wake up in the morning and everything seems to be normal, and for the first few minutes I actually forget about what's happened and I go about my way. It's only when I pack up and start heading out that I realise what happened was really bizarre. I have everything together and I can't see the tracks from before now because more snow is set, only my own new ones. I go to take a look at the cabin and I can just about make out a figure again, this time just off to the side of the cabin, just like before. Just before fear sets in, I noticed another one to the side of it, then one other just to the right and in the far distance, almost filming a circle around the cabin. I realise something's very off and I grip my knife very tightly. I sprint hike basically the whole way back to where my truck is, and I then start the long drive back home. Even in this very moment now where I'm writing up my experience for you all, I still don't know what happened that day. It did put me off doing any kind of hiking or exploring or going out to cabins, though I have since returned to camping trips with groups of friends, but I've never went out alone again and I don't think I ever will. I'm certainly never going back to that cabin. My mum has many interesting stories about the little house she raised her half-sister in back in the 90s, but this one has definitely puzzled me. She said it was around the same time she met my dad, and like any other summer night, they usually kept the windows open for air. They had one big window in the living room facing the front yard outside. She said my dad had heard something in the bushes that sit right under the window. They both looked in that direction, but the living room lights are on, so you can't really see the screen. She said it got pretty loud and eventually made out a flapping sound, maybe a bird. But the sound got a lot heavier, like there was something huge trying to fly away. She said they could both hear thick wings like a bat, but can't see anything. They're both too scared to turn the light or go outside, but it eventually stopped. Never heard anything like it since. They live/still live in the Indiana area, so there aren't many huge birds or animals up there that could have made it. A bit Pacific and eerie to make up, I think, but very weird. Our home sits on the edge of 200 acres of woods with well-established trails running through. I've been exploring back there for 6 years now and know the trails very well. Yesterday, early in the evening, I went back with my dog and headed down with our most well-travelled path. There was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. I was just watching the deer and eating wild blackberries. This is something I've done before. I come to a familiar clearing where some equipment owned by the gas company is, and I suddenly felt disorientated, almost dizzy. I was just standing there looking around at the clearing and the trails, which look both familiar and strange simultaneously. Then I noticed what appears to be a house down the trail to my left. There shouldn't be any houses there and I felt scared. But I walked that way anyway. I know, not smart. I got down the trail and realised it was my son's elementary school, which does border the woods but not on the side and not where I am. I was genuinely scared at this point and kept looking around wondering what the hell happened. How did I get so disorientated and manage to turn around so quick? I got home fine and nothing else really scary happened, but I just cannot wrap my mind around what happened. In January of 2020, my brother, fiance, kid and I decided to go backpacking in southern Indiana. We stayed at a shelter that is close to the Ohio River. At about 1 PM, my brother and my kid were asleep and my fiance and I were out by the fire just talking. My fiance got scared and pointed to multiple lights in the woods. It looked as though there's 5 to 10 people out there with flashlights coming towards us. I go and get my brother up so he can see and get his gun if needed, but before I get him up, one by one, the lights started to disappear. We spoke with him about it the following morning and he said it was probably just lights from the boats and reflections. Then the next night, we waited for boats to pass by again, and none of them made the same light as the one before. And we knew we saw the lights then, and it seemed too far away from the river to be redirected into the woods or to reflect like that. Then, around 5 or 5:30 in the morning of the third day, while I was laying there in the shelter and everyone else was asleep, I was awoken by the sound of people whispering. Then I saw a shadow or something through the cracks of the shelter. I poked my head around expecting to see someone, but literally no one was there. We've been back to that exact spot multiple times since and haven't experienced anything like it since. I used to live in Wells, Nevada, a tiny town, really. The only thing to do is go backpacking and hunt most of the time. It was usually great, however, one particular trip stands out to me. I was a naught but a wee lad, at the tender age of 14 when my father decides to take me on a trip to Jarbridge. It's an absolutely beautiful area and the trip is absolutely stunning, with lots of abandoned buildings to check out and things to explore. Tons of stuff to do. Anyhow, we drove out and decided to explore this building that obviously has been abandoned long ago. I had a 12 gauge with me as well as my 44 strapped to my hip. Just because I'm from a gun savvy family, I suppose. This is important for the next part. We walk up to the door to the place but I heard something incredibly odd. It sounded like somebody was sawing on something like a piece of wood. I tugged at my dad and told him what I heard, but he just shrugs it off. Just after I told him, a voice came from inside telling us to come in. It was obviously from an older gentleman, but nevertheless made us jump. My father is extremely outgoing, however, and decides to go in despite my repeated attempts at doing the exact opposite. So when we went in, the first thing the man says is, "You ain't gonna shoot me with that, are you now, son?" I quickly shook my head no and gave a gentle laugh. I thought he was joking. My father introduces himself and I, as well as my younger brother. The man then introduces himself. He immediately says he's 127 but couldn't have been more than 80, and that he'd been raised around here, which is as follows, and I can remember roughly how the conversation went, saying, well, I was born here in this hometown with my siblings, because my father had gone out and froze himself to death in the harsh winters we got around here. It ain't that long after I was born, I followed in his footsteps and tried crawling out into the snow. I about froze to death, but Ma saved me by finding me out there in the snow, dragging me inside, but she froze to death herself doing it. Did you bring any potatoes? I'll tell ya. I was in Ireland during the famine. I could really use some potatoes. In fact, my cousin served in World War II but was killed and reincarnated as my brother. Anyway, I used to work down in Las Vegas. I built over 1,000 motels and home. I built this place here too, actually. I also helped build the Notre Dame, as I'm very religious, but god damn it, somebody stole the doors right off the place. Now at this point, as he looked at me and said again, "Are you gonna shoot me, boy?" I said no, and put my gun near the door to put him at ease. At this point, I can see behind him, and I can see a table that's laid out with perfect china and proper silverware for four, the exact number of us there. I returned to my seat, had an incredibly uneasy feeling I've never felt before or since, because it was disturbing. I started telling my dad that we had to go, but before I could finish, we heard the sound of tyres coming down the road. The old man leapt to his feet, immediately disturbed. What? Who? Why is someone here? No one's supposed to be here. He began walking towards the door, which is where I'd set my shotgun down. My dad also jumped up and we quickly left. I'd never felt so disturbed in my life. We let the other folks who'd pulled up to the property know about it, saying it's really not wise to go in there. And we jumped in the truck and left. When we got home, of course, I told everyone about it. A buddy did a bit of research and I found out that Pruti's where a local family came with a long history of having issues. And this person was real, but however, had an obituary from 5 years prior to us meeting him. Now I don't know if it was the same individual, but my god was it scary. The weirdest one that I had was while hiking with my brother and we stumbled upon a grow up on the side of a hill in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't too far from a small community, but it was a few miles up a steep creek bed. We had taken a rugged logging road to get there and then hiked along a very rough trail we found. There was probably 50 very healthy marijuana plants there. It was on crown public land, so we weren't allowed to hike there, but we sure didn't hang around to find out whose it was. Another time we're hiking to the top of a mountain, looking for interesting rocks. The mountains were known to the local natives as a spiritual site, and there was definitely the sense of otherworldliness in the air. Now evening was coming, so we were heading back to my car. We found a car inn made of rocks balanced together. As we started to approach it, there was something bright orange in the space formed between the leaning rocks, right in the center of the configuration. It looked like something man-made and was jarringly out of place in this very isolated setting. When we got near it, we realized the bright orange was the last tiny drop of sunlight. Literally everywhere else is shadowy, that had somehow fallen right into the center of it for us to find out. It was bright orange because it was late summer and there was lots of wildfires in the area. Of course it was just a coincidence, but it seems like more than that. And this reminds me of another one. We were driving down to a remote mountain road after a day of fishing. It was dark and suddenly we come across a mysterious cloud of smoke enveloping the road. We couldn't see the source of it and we were at least 15 miles away from any houses. We stopped the car and when we walked back up to the road we could see a bit, and about 50 feet from the road in a little gully there's a wildfire burning. It was about 10 feet by 10 feet and warm enough that we could feel it from the road. The creepy part about that is that when we drove up that road earlier in the day to get to the lake, we noticed a faint smoky smell. It must have been sparked by some lightning there and was slowly growing and absolutely become massive. This was a remote road and we had not found it before. We just know the fire must have got huge, but we did report it. Okay, I've got one for you all. I live in a rural area about 30 minutes of West Palm Spring in Southern California. My cousin and I decided to go hiking some hills that are about 20 minutes north in an area called Oakland. There was no trail to get back into the hills and we actually had to trespass on a fire camp and follow a stream up towards the hills. We started climbing the hills and reached the peak of a very steep area. I realised we're way away from where the car park is and I don't even know where the road is. On top of that, all the fog is heavily rolling in now, and we only have about 35 minutes of light remaining. We attempt to take a shortcut down the hill by sliding on our butts down a steep slope. To add dismay, we ended up on the side of a 30 feet rock wall. Long story short, we managed to scale down the rock, but not before a football-sized rock falls on my cousin's head and he starts bleeding heavily and is disorientated. We start walking the direction that the car's in, with the fog still heavy around us. Now we're not sure if we're going the right way, and my cousin is bleeding a lot, and suddenly we come across a 40-foot building with thick concrete walls, set mostly below ground like a bunker, in the middle of a forest. Now the windows had bars on them, and the door is heavy sealed. My cousin wanted to check it out, but we're getting a bad vibe from it. He was saying something was drawing him into it. Now I don't believe in the supernatural, but I would not let him in. It's a really eerie place. Shortly after we pass the house, and the fog lifts up a lot, and luckily we stumble upon a foot trail. A weird note. We hike back there a couple of days later during full daylight and looked for the place, but seriously cannot find it again. We literally hiked there for hours. Now on a second weird note, my wallet fell out of my back pocket, and when we're sliding down the hill, we ended up getting back far away from Charles, but my ID showed up in the mail a week later in an envelope with no note or shipping address. Doing a group trip in the woods, literally 40 minutes from any town, we ask our group leader if we can go back to our cabin as night rolls around. He says sure, and we begin to walk. We have to walk through a path that's 10 minutes long and in the middle of a thick forest. When we're about halfway to the cabin, I get an uneasy feeling. I turn around and literally 10 feet behind us is this guy in a yellow poncho following us. I tell my friends and we all turn around, but none of us recognized him. The guy in the poncho just smiles at us for a second and then runs off the path into the woods. So my friends and I sprint to the cabin and enter. The rest of the group is already there. We tell the group leader about it and he calls the other leaders and they start looking around, but they don't find anything. But a new rule is put into place that requires somebody to be with the leader at all times when you're outside, or just go into some of the cabins that are further away. I debated on whether or not to actually share this, as it's a super short amount of time and I didn't see anything, but I ultimately decided that maybe I should go for it. My husband, 28, and I, 25, stay in a small town that borders an absolutely massive redwood forest. We're about 15 minutes or less away from the trees of mystery. We live on a street that was built in the middle of the forest for whatever reason. Now there's two large patches, maybe 5 or 15 miles plus, one of which has a small forest bridge that connects to an even larger forest. On either end of our street, I will also say we tend to be night owls, preferring to stay up late and wake up late. So, the set into what happened. My husband was getting ready for bed while I sat under the covers. It was a nice cool night after a hot day, so I opened the window to just curl up under my blankets for 5 minutes with the wonderful air on my face. While laying on my phone on my side, not fully asleep, I then began to look up and I can see a full moon. I was surprised to find that the moon was on 100% tonight, so I looked outside my window from my bedside and confirmed the amount of light on the ground outside on our street, which has no street lights since it's an old street. It's very well lit in a bluish tone colour. I was kind of like, oh, neat, and went back to my phone. I wait for my husband to get into bed before I start falling asleep. I don't know if it's a comfort thing or not, but I usually can't sleep well unless he's near me. I was wide awake, sitting there for about 5-ish minutes listening to the crickets outside when I can hear a man scream up my street. It sounded like it was coming 2 or 3 doors down, near to one of the edges of the forest. At first it was just a fearful scream, but then it moved and continued to almost like a guy doing a fake scream. Why? It's 2 a.m, but the scream goes on for far too long, and then at the tail end of it, it went from kind of like a silly fake one to a deep, gurgling roar, similar to, I don't know, like something transforming in the movies. But at first, it doesn't sound real, almost like something forcing or pretending a scream, then a very deep sound afterwards. I don't recall whether or not the crickets went silent, by the way. I just know that I was no longer trying to listen to them after hearing that noise. I have wondered Sasquatch or maybe werewolf or dogman, some other creepy critter like that, or God knows what. But I know nothing normal or person should be able to scream for that long or that deep. Plus it echoed and felt like it was reverberating off a speaker in a room, but of course it wasn't. I've gone through every possibility and not really had any explanation as to what this scream was. I am neither of the things in this title, however. I was in a Firewise program with the county. We clearly and thoroughly searched 400 square feet and found somebody's house. Anyway, we were clearing brush around an elderly man's home and he suggested over and over again that this one area is of no threat and we just skip it. Well, we can't just skip it. That'd leave a weak spot, so we have no choice. After getting almost all of it clear, there was a bit of a ladder fuel in one area. We used a bladder weed eater to do this kind of thing. After getting almost the entire area of a 10 or 15 foot square patch cleared, I could not knock down this one patch level to the ground. I've actually dented the blades trying to do this, realizing I was hitting a metal bar, so I dug around it and realized it was a refrigerator buried so deep with only one handle sticking out. After finding this, I alert my co-worker. Now, by the way, we never found anything like this. Usually it's just trees and stuff. So he comes up and we play a game. No, you open it game. After about 5 minutes, curiosity gets the better of me and I go for it, but it's jammed. So I started reaming on it and he helps me and kind of screeches a little bit. It smelt like nothing I've ever smelt before. The most horrid stench. We back up like 30 feet and it doesn't help, so I walk up and open it all the way. The smell made my eyes water and regret having a nose. My mouth was open a little bit and I could really taste this stench. I figure, what the hell? The worst already happened. I peek inside and it's an assortment of bones. I can't tell if it's animal or not. There are no horn skulls, if that makes sense. Just random figurements like ribs and long bones, like ones in animals' legs, I think. So we mention this to our boss and he says he'll put it in a report. A couple of weeks later it becomes a, I don't know the word, area of interest I guess, and apparently another service has to investigate. However, since this was the very last of the entire area to be cleared, once we had left that day, nobody went back until the crew arrived a month later, only to find a very large hole where the fridge was. The homeowner denies having any clue about it whatsoever. I still don't know what I stumbled upon. So story time. A couple of years ago, I lived in a house outside of Charlotte that was right next to what our city folk called a greenway. Essentially, it's really an undeveloped land between existing developments that, due to the layout of the infrastructure and topography land, could not be clear-cut and paved enough to make it cost-effective, so they just put up trails and parks and sold it as a natural spot to increase the property values in the area. Well, my girlfriend at the time had a daughter, and the daughter's school was on this one-way end of the greenway, and we live on the other. It actually took less time to walk there than to drive, so on nice days, I'd grab the stroller, carry it to her school, and pick her up at the end of the day, and then we'd have a really nice walk through the woods. Well, this particular greenway waved through some areas that were pretty close to rather busy roads, so it wasn't unusual to hear road noises like big trucks or motorcycles or whatever. Turns out that coyotes in this area responded to things like fire engines, sirens, much in the way that they did in any other situation. Long story short, I have my girlfriend's kid in the middle of the woods and we hear a fire engine, and as the sound dies from there, we hear dozens of coyotes responding in kind. Now they completely surround us. Normally I wouldn't be very afraid. It's very unusual even for a pack of coyotes to attack humans. However, I remembered the uncomfortable truth that sometimes they do, and can actually attack dogs and, eat and kill them once they've surrounded them. So parent mode kicks in. While trying to maintain calmness as to not freak out the kid, I pick her up and carry her in one arm and the stroller in the other. I ran as fast as I could the remaining distance, I don't know, maybe half a mile or so. This took me maybe all of 5 minutes, but it was honestly the scariest thing of my life. So a girlfriend and I took a 2-week road trip last year and backwards camped/hiked the whole time. As some insight, I'm also a girl, so there's two 20-something-year-olds out on the road. We got to one free campsite in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, and we're the only people out here. Not unusual, so we just take up the first spot and set up. As we make dinner, a couple pulls in, drives by and heads to the back of the campgrounds. We don't really know how far back they went. About 20 minutes later, they come by and flag me down. Girl, have you been back there? Me, no. Girl, it's a massacre back there. What do you mean? There's bones everywhere. Mind if we take the spot next to you? No, not at all. Then maybe 2 minutes later, look around, get back into the car and leave. I say, what's all that about? I explained to my friend what the girls said, and at that moment, we look down and see a huge femur bone at our feet, possibly from a cow. Well, us being a little cryptic, decide to go and check out what they're talking about. About 100 yards back, through the windy camp, and there it is. There's full-blown animal carcasses everywhere, some scattered and some still whole. And there's one pile of what appears to be fox fur, another deer body in a trash bag. Our theory is that's where they dump all the roadkill, which they scrape up off the highway. But we didn't figure this out for a few days. Nonetheless, if there's that many bodies there, it's weird where they come from, because there must be a massive predator that we don't know about. So we decided to pack up and find a different camp. For campsite 2 at the night, we're about an hour or so drive, still in the middle of nowhere. Haven't seen a single car this time, no houses, just old country roads and pastures. Mind you, the sun is setting. The road turns to dirt for a bit. We cross a cattle guard and see the national park sign. Sweet, it's a national park and it's free. It can't be too bad. My friend thinks it looks a little sketchy, but we're ready to relax and grab some food. So I hit a left and start up the hill to the national park. Looks like it's only about 2 miles from the map. We start going up this road, go around a few curves, and on the side, we realise that the brush is getting thicker and thicker, and the road starts getting rough. Now to put this into perspective, we're in a fairly new Chevy, manual transmission. It's less than a foot clearance from the ground. About a quarter of a mile in, we high center on a massive rock. Okay, as long as this doesn't get any worse, I think we can manage. There's no possible way to turn around or get back, so we have to keep going. Of course it got worse. Every rock and trench we hear the car scrape and shutter and stall. I'm clinching the wheel, she is clinching the handle. All the brush on the side of us is now dead and eerie looking, and the sun is almost gone behind us. 30 terrifying minutes later, we finally make it to the top flat that is supposed to be a campsite. It's about 10 square foot clearing in the middle of the dead brush, and in front of us a cliff. We're still freaking out about the dead animals, but now we feel like we're in the middle of a low budget horror film, and we need to get out of there. Now, we decide we cannot in our right mind stay here. Even from the cliff top, we can't see a single house or car light. We decide to make a 10-point turn between the brush and the boulder and the cliff, manage to get back on the path and very slowly and carefully, terrified all the way, get back down the damn hill. We in the car managed to miraculously survive and head out after 2 hours back to the closest town and sleep in a Walmart parking lot. I was backpacking in the Beartooth Wilderness in the early 2000s with a good friend of mine. 3 days into the hike, we had only seen one other couple. On the third night, at about 4 AM, we're woken to our tents, in which sounds like the scream of a massive animal. Obviously we're freaked out, sitting in the tent not knowing what was out there. We started hearing what sounded like howl for about 15 minutes, followed by heavy footsteps near our camp. My friend and I started yelling, making tons of noise, a trick that tends to fend off bears. The commotion outside of the tent comes to a halt slowly. The following morning, after not sleeping at all, we unzipped the tent to the creepiest scene. All around the tent are pebbles. The howl was literally thousands of pebbles that had been thrown across. Now, they surround the tent in a nearly perfect circle of 20 or so boulders. I mean, these must be 150 or 300 pounds. My friend and I noped out of there, making a 3-day hike in one, practically running the whole way to the car. I've been in 2 bad car accidents. I know the rush of adrenaline going through your head when you're in a crash. For that reason, I pull over at any crash I see to help out, unless emergency services are already there. I have a level head, basic medical training, and usually a first aid kit on me. Normally, everything is fine, and I leave once EMS/police show up. Today, that totally changed. I came around a bend and saw a pickup that had hit a tree. A body was slumped over in the seat. I immediately pulled my bike into subdivision right across the street and ran over. Quickly grabbing my bag, taking off my jacket and helmet, I see a white man in his late 20s with a slim frame slumped over in the seat. Confused. I'm not sure what his situation is. I can see that there's saliva dropping down the side of his face. My brain instantly went to seizure. The car who's been a little behind me also pulled over. The driver's calling 911 right next to me. He tapped on the window a bit, and there was no response. I jumped into the bed to see if the back window was. None of them were there. I hopped out and went to see if anything has changed. The driver's no longer convulsing, but he was still non-responsive. I knocked on the window to see if he had come out of it. The driver jumped up and began panicking. This is pretty common for someone who's had a seizure, especially if they've had a traumatic experience on top of it. He began yelling and lightly punching the window. This happened for a span of around a second, which meant I jumped 20 feet in the air. Once my brain cleared for a second, I loudly say, "Are you alright?" if he could unlock the door. Luckily for me, he didn't understand a word I said. He slumped back over, which prompts me to knock again. He then jumps back up and promptly begins freaking out once again. After a quick moment, he calms down again and sat there smiling. It wasn't a normal smile. It was sort of haunting. His tongue was hanging out, very yellowed. The man who pulled over with me, Mark, came around, which brought another round of freaking out. This began the pattern of any new stimuli causing him to freak out. A third person pulled over and came to check in. He quickly came to the same conclusion: drugs. Our driver was now in a relaxed state until the sirens started. Me and a third person began directing traffic while Mark kept an eye on the driver, relaying everything to 911. I had to move my jacket, helmet and bag over near my bike, just in case he started driving again. About a minute after we heard the first sirens, the fire truck, ambulance and sheriff pulled up. The fire truck blocked traffic from one end, and after briefly talking to the cop, Mark went to start turning cars around from the other direction. A cop pulled up from the end blocked by the fire truck. The two cops, after determining that the driver was combative, drew their tasers. A firefighter used a pick to break open the driver's side window. After the first hit, the driver began to claw at the back window. Once it had been pulled out, the cops began yelling at him to open the door. Par for the course. The driver doesn't get a word. They decide to smash the front window. After the first hit, they didn't have to do much, as the driver began hitting back. He punched the window out entirely. The cops yelled some more. The driver's still yelling and punching. The first cop tased him. If we didn't hear the crackling, we wouldn't have known he was tased. He's still punching. Second cop tases him. Still nothing. First cop again. Second cop. And the first cop tased again. And the second cop opens the door. The driver begins kicking and punching while getting dragged out of the car. The cops attempt to hold him down. The largest of the firefighters jumps on him, and now there's 6 cars flying up the road towards us. They all ran over to assist. Now, eventually me and Mark had to stick around to be interviewed by the highway officer. This experience really made me scared of people and drugs, as I wasn't already. It really turns them into some kind of monster out of a film, almost unstoppable. This happened only a couple of months ago, so I'm still quite on the edge. I had a group of friends that lived about an hour and a half away from me, and I'd frequently go hang out with them. The drive never bothered me, but this particular night I dreaded it. I first noticed a car about 20 minutes into my trip home. It was about 2 AM, so not many cars are on the road. Now this guy was practically hitting my bumper the whole way, which is strange because there's no other cars there. I quickly wrote it off and turned on my music. The time on the freeway is about an hour, and he was behind me the entirety of it. When I saw he was getting off the same exit, I began getting nervous. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I was heading home as I normally would, until I noticed this car making every turn behind me. I start turning down random roads testing my theory, and he's trailing me the whole time. I stop going towards my home and start driving random, trying to think of what to do. I tried whipping down roads at this last second, but it didn't work. I was driving through red lights and stop signs because I was so scared of what might happen if I stopped. By this point I was desperate. I decided to call the police, telling them that I'd been followed for over an hour. I gave them a description of the car and my location. The dispatcher told me to drive to the police station, and there's going to be officers waiting in the parking lot. As soon as I turned to the parking lot, the driver sped off. One of the police cruisers immediately flips their lights on and followed them. I give my statement but never hear anything back. This happened just a few days ago, while I was walking home from work. I should explain, I live in a small rural community. It's a very safe rather quiet town I walk to and from work every day. I carry both a box cutter and pepper spray at all times. I feel rather comfortable walking at night and actually find it calming. It was about 10:15 on this particular night when my journey began. I had a very uneasy feeling that I couldn't place. I decided to call my boyfriend. I knew he couldn't do much since he's at least 3 hours away, but at least he could call the police if something happened. We talked and laughed as long as I walked. Everything was fine. That was until I passed the Goodwill parking lot, which is a halfway point. I looked over and saw a man sitting in his truck staring at me. I didn't think much of it. People can be odd, and perhaps he was simply dozing. As I passed the parking lot, I heard the truck start up behind me and felt a little uneasy. We just kept walking, thinking I'm being paranoid. I should also note that there's a young man walking 300 feet in front of me. He kept stopping in the middle of the sidewalk. Because of this, I walked slower than I would normally. I didn't want to catch up with him. Eventually he crossed the street and I began to pick up the pace. As I was about to reach the entrance to my neighbourhood, the truck from before flew around the corner, stopping 500 feet in front of me. He turned his truck so it's blocking the road. I'm now freaking out. I tell my boyfriend what's happening. He says don't worry, everything will be okay. I continue walking and watched as this man got out of his truck, standing in front of it, staring directly at me. I put my head down, tightly grasping my box cutter. I got closer and closer to the man, my breathing getting heavier and heavier. I could tell he was at least 6 feet tall, and the streetlight shone down on him. I can see his arms bulge. I'm only 5 foot. Now I'm pretty small too. Suddenly though, a car came from down the street, maneuvering around the truck. About 30 seconds later, a car followed suit, then a third. When the fourth car passed, I saw the man smack his fist in frustration. He clumsily climbs back inside, took a sharp U-turn before tearing out of the neighbourhood. If those cars had not come by, I honestly don't know what would have happened to me. Let me start by saying that I really enjoy driving, and I'll often be on the road for hours just listening to music, getting lost. So more often than not, I sleep in my car on the side of a country road. I don't like it when I'm the passenger though. I always go alone. Usually, I sleep for a bit, wake up, then go home without incident. There's been a couple of times when a deer has startled me, or even a person knocking on my window to make sure I was okay. Always met with a scream. But what happened last night absolutely takes the cake. I took my dogs up to a really nice walk that I've read about online. I was about an hour drive, and I'd planned to drive for an hour at a time, explore a bit, then keep going so the dogs didn't get restless or bored. I'd always taken plenty of food and water, and was planning to be gone before about a day, which I was going to a park in a popular parking spot that caravanners like to go overnight. It was lovely. I had myself and my dog. We had a really good time. We arrived at a sleeping destination and found that there wasn't any place that we could actually park. The bays weren't laid out, so You had to use common sense to find a spot, so you're not blocking anyone in. The parking area was free, and could only contain about 10 caravans without being too tight. I was a little annoyed, but hey, we're in a very rural area here, so it kind of makes sense. I let the dogs out to do their business and went to sleep, thinking nothing of it. To describe where I parked, it was opposite a little cottage, but not directly in front of it. There's plenty of trees there, and I don't feel nervous or anything. I know I'm not intruding on the owners in any way. I feel safe. For some reason though, I was having trouble nodding off. Usually I sleep like a baby in my car, but it's very spacious and comfortable. As silly as it may sound, to some I genuinely thought I had nothing to worry about. That was until a long, high-pitched screaming sound woke me up, and the dogs at around 11 PM. The dogs go nuts, as they usually do at the drop of a hat. I was still in a confused daze when I see a very tall man dragging what I think is a key around the perimeter of my car. He goes very slowly, not taking his eyes off me the entire time. He has a very malicious grin on his face all the while he's doing so. Horrified, I crank up my chair and start the car, ready to floor it, but he had made his way to the front of my bonnet, blocking me from reversing. This is when I thought that he was holding a butcher's knife. He held it up and waved it at me. I scream and lay on the horn. My dogs had leapt over the back seat and were practically frothing at the mouth, but it didn't faze him. This lasted about 10 to 15 seconds, not long. He then slowly walked away across the road into the cottage. I drove home without stopping. I'm never doing that again. Thanks for ruining it for me, terrifying guy. Thanks for ruining the paintwork. And thank God for cars being able to be locked. This happened my senior high school year. I was driving home alone from a movie with my friend on a Saturday night. After about the first 5 minutes, it became the same route I drove to school every day, so I was kind of on autopilot. I never text and drive and rarely speed, and definitely was not speeding because I have my junior license. I was pulling up to a light that had just turned green in enough time that I did not have to slow down. I went through the light. Then I just remembered the most force I've ever felt in my life. I opened my eyes when I heard a man banging on my window, yelling in, asking if I could get out or needed help breaking the window. I was able to get my seatbelt off. I managed to unlock it. I then went to look for my phone and the man said, "Forget the phone. I've already called the police. Please sit down on that hill far away. It's smoking and I want to make sure there's no fire." So I sit where he tells me after he says, "Am I okay?" My hand had glass in it as well as my face. Nothing life-threatening though, so I just sat there until the ambulance arrives. Right as I get on the hill, I heard the man who was yelling, saying, "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" and just took off in full sprint down the road. I was so confused. Why was this man who was just helping me chasing this poor 50-ish-year-old woman down the road? I realised it was a woman who hit me because she was nowhere to be seen initially after he got her out of the car. She was trying to flee the scene. The man successfully got her and brought her back to the scene. The cops arrive and go back to her immediately and breathalyze her. He then gives his statement. All while this was happening, there's this boy outside of his house who come and brought me a bag of M&Ms and says, "Wow, you spun so much. Does it hurt?" I had no idea my car had spun. All of a sudden, I hear lots of swearing, saying, "You think this is on me? No, you hit me." The poor boy is standing next to me. I told him to go back to his mum. I'm thankful he did. Definitely not the same for an 8-year-old. The woman screaming and swearing. She then tried to come towards me and one of the officers, but gets held back. At this point, they said she blew a .23 and they put her into handcuffs. I had yet to give a statement to the cops and I thought, what am I supposed to say? Then I realised in the midst of all this, I forget to even call my parents. My mum was across the country for work, so I called my dad. My dad was at a concert 3 hours away, so he called my neighbour. My neighbour, who's one of our best family friends, calls me and says, "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't say anything to the cops until you tell me the story first." I then tell him that I'm nervous because I was the one to T-bone her. He said, "Just tell me what happened." And I said, "I went through 100% green light and the lady went through the red hitting me and she blew a .23. He lost it. He went over and said, "You almost just killed an 18-year-old because you got behind a wheel after drinking. How stupid are you to be doing this?" And she said, "Well, I wish I'd actually killed her," and started swearing again. She went on to scream the entire time we're there. Just, saying I was awful and that she wished she'd killed me. Finally, the cops take her away. My car was completely done. It was a Volvo, and the cops said they've seen this car do really well in different accidents and it probably helped save me. I thought I was going to have to see her in court, but she didn't even show up. I hope to never see her again. I wish I got the name or number of the man who helped me. He just disappeared after giving his statement. A real hero. I really don't know what would have happened if he wasn't there and I was left with that crazy lady.